Okay, so you're probably, thoroughly acquainted with the ideas and a lot of the thinking around the connections between uh, Heart of Darkness, the novella, and Blood Meridian. You're probably also very aware of the connections between Heart of Darkness and the movie Apocalypse Now. Um, and we know that the judge from Blood Meridian is definitely got some intentional connections to Kurtz from Heart of Darkness, and obviously Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now is very strongly correlated with the Kurtz character from Heart of Darkness too. But one of the things that I've been thinking about are some of the unique ways that the Colonel Kurtz of Apocalypse Now is like the judge, but he's not necessarily like the Kurtz of Heart of Darkness. So there's some easy stuff that that both of the Kurtzes and the judge have in common. So some of those would be like just some like no hair, the whiteness of their appearance. Those are things that all three of those characters have in common. There's also kind of like a similar sort of like some of the feelings of like omniscience. There's kind of like the more human characteristics like magnanimity or charisma, but then there's some kind of like otherworldly, maybe like more human than human sort of characteristics, like um, ability to influence other people in almost a sovereign, kind of like omniscient sort of a way, like a knowledge about the world, about like kind of like cosmology type stuff, but also just like really practical stuff too, like kind of a knowledge of how to like get stuff done, that all three of those characters kind of seem like they have in common too. But one of the things that is, kind of one important thematic difference that seems like to me is that, so obviously in the novella Heart of Darkness, there's this idea that as the boat crew goes up the river, they're going further and further into some sort of kind of like evil, chaos, that sort of thing. But it's not connected specifically to war in the way that it is in Apocalypse Now, but then also in the narrative structure of Blood Meridian. And so, like now, Blood Meridian, like the gang is not at war, but whenever we hear Judge Holden's kind of theorizing on what they're up to and what they're doing, obviously, like he really famously puts that in terms of war. So he kind of understands like all of human activity as being like war is kind of like it's the highest metaphor and the purest expression of what it means to be human. And to me, that seems in terms of like kind of thematic stuff, very, very similar to what's going on in Apocalypse Now. And even when you think about, if you think about Kurtz as being the guy who's got like the highest and most comprehensive view of what the war itself means, and then you kind of think about all the other comments on the war itself and on the idea of war in general. I think there's some thematic connections that you can make there, and then in terms of so that's kind of like a big one, like a big, kind of like a global sort of thematic connection. But then in terms of some like more kind of practical cues, that things that would connect Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now to the judge from Blood Meridian in a way that is different than Kurtz of Heart of Darkness. So the Colonel Kurtz of Apocalypse Now is physically imposing. There's been a lot that's been said about about Marlon Brando's physique, and that's a difference in Heart of Darkness. So whenever you actually run into Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, he's like frail, so that's a big one. This idea too of being kind of like a master of war. So obviously the Kurtz of Heart of Darkness did a lot of bad stuff, but he didn't do it as some sort of kind of like warlord in the same way that Colonel Kurtz did. Colonel Kurtz, there's kind of this idea that maybe one of the things he's doing is he's raising his own army with his own ends in mind. Whereas the Kurtz of Heart of Darkness kind of seems like maybe he's making himself to be more of like a governor of his own state or something like that. So specifically making it kind of like this warlord sort of an idea that's going on with Colonel Kurtz is kind of like a more kind of tangible connection to the judge. This idea too, so You might remember in Blood Meridian when the judge talks about this idea of suzerainty or suzerainties, like the kind of lordship idea. Um, there's kind of like a um, uh, kind of like a way to get results through another person that goes along with that kind of like governance idea. That to me, I felt like in thinking about it, that's again another Colonel Kurtz thing. Like you even see the last guy who was like Willard, who got sent in to go get Colonel Kurtz, actually became like one of his minions. You know, he becomes like one of his people. Even like the war reporter, the guy that's played by Dennis Hopper, similar sort of a thing there. He kind of becomes one of the, you know, kind of he gets like proselytized into becoming an acolyte of Colonel Kurtz's too. And then he himself becomes kind of like an apostle for him. You don't, at least I can't remember any kind of similar stuff like that happened with the Kurtz of Heart of Darkness. And that's another kind of like, there's kind of like that lordship idea that's there too. And yeah, so kind of like that kind of like sovereignty sort of thing seems like way more of a connection between Colonel Kurtz. But another one too, I don't think, I was trying to kind of check on this just to see, and obviously I didn't do it super comprehensively, but I don't think you ever get any mentions of the Kurtz in Heart of Darkness of being associated with children in any way. But one of the things, especially in the Redux version of Apocalypse Now, Kurtz is kind of like there are little children around him all the time, and that's kind of like in a weird way, it's like a symbol of his like kind of like malevolent generativity. But there's also just something like kind of like weird and scary and ominous and extra kind of like evil feeling that he's got this kind of like these like, you know, little kids that are kind of like at his heels, and they're kind of like in his crew, you know. But then he's this like murderous, scary, megalomaniacal character. And then obviously that's another one with the judge too. So the judge is also, you know, associated with kids in a really scary way. His is, you know, more evil. Really, the judge is like, he's more evil than anybody and everybody because in a sense, he's maybe the most evil thing that's ever existed. You know, and but like, again, that's another thing that's like seems to me like a connection between the Colonel Kurtz of Apocalypse Now and the judge that is not a similarity between the Kurtz of Heart of Darkness. So why is this interesting, or why is this worth talking about? Well, for one thing, it's kind of just interesting to think about the connections between Apocalypse Now and Blood Meridian that have like the common ancestry of Heart of Darkness, but that they each of those, the two new ones, you know, Blood Meridian and Apocalypse Now, are doing something a little bit different with some of the thematic material, the thematic source material that they have. But the other thing that I think is interesting to think about is maybe whether or not there was some kind of like conscious influence from Colonel Kurtz on the part of Cormac McCarthy whenever he wrote Blood Meridian and when he wrote The Judge, because there's almost like, you know, for a guy that loves Heart of Darkness, I'd say there's pretty much no conceivable way that, even though he's like a big time kind of like you know, simple living Philistine type guy, I feel like there's almost no way to imagine that Cormac McCarthy didn't see Apocalypse Now, and because Heart of Darkness is obviously really important to him, that it probably didn't hit him pretty hard. And yeah, so and there are some of those kinds of like ideas, those kind of thematic connections that just seem like too like meaty to not really think that there could be something there. So it's interesting to think about as like an area of inquiry, and it's worth kind of like, you know, teasing out the particulars of that a little bit, but it's also kind of interesting to think about whether or not it was like a self-conscious thing on the part of Cormac McCarthy. So kind of a fun connection. I'd be curious if you've had any similar thoughts, and if so, what were they?